Okay, so we finished with property distribution. Now is the other side of the balance sheet. We're going to be talking about how we split up debts. Very rarely will you have a termination of a marriage, either a dissolution or a divorce, where the marital debts don't exist. Our typical ones are going to be credit cards, a mortgage, and a car payment. Those are our typical debts. There can be student loans, which are also debts, and we're going to deal with them a little bit separately than these debts. Just like with our marital assets, we look at the debt and we first of all say, who got the benefit of that debt? So if it is a car loan and the wife has decided to keep the car, well, she's obviously getting the benefit of that debt. That debt is probably going to go to her. Let's say that the husband is going to keep the house and there's a mortgage. Well, then the husband is going to have to assume that debt. Credit card debt is the tough one. Credit card debt, it's hard to say who got what. Now, some things are easy. Maybe the husband, and I'm going to be very sexist here, maybe the husband has a Home Depot credit card and he bought a lawnmower and he cuts the grass and that's his. Okay, well then that debt's going to go to him. Or maybe the wife has a Victoria's Secret credit card. Obviously, that debt benefits her. She's going to keep that. Typically, however, most debt is for things like groceries or gas or clothes for kids or clothing, stuff that it's hard to kind of separate out. And so what the court does is looks at who is most capable of paying the debt. It doesn't really make much sense to say, okay, spouse number one, you make $24,000 a year. Spouse number two, you make $75,000 a year. Together you make roughly $100,000 a year, but we're going to split the debts down the middle when one spouse only earns 25% of the marital income and the other spouse earns 3/4 of that debt. Where the income of the spouses is different, where we have one person here and one person here, what the court is going to do is look at that gray area, usually of credit card debt, and say, okay, you make 3 times as much as the other person, you're going to pay 3 times as much of the debt because you are financially able to. Why does the court do that? Well, the court wants to make sure the debt gets paid. Let's be honest. If the court splits it 50-50, what's the chances of that debt getting paid? You know, most people, most married couples, the biggest stress in their life is paying the bills. And most people get divorced over paying the bills. It's not over an adulterous affair. It's not over really anything other than financial stress and then what blows up out of that. And so making sure the debt gets paid is not a small thing, because if people who get divorced walk away from their debt and they don't pay it, it starts a ripple effect in the world. And so we want to make sure that people's credit is maintained. We want to make sure that they have the ability to pay the debt. And so that's why the court looks at debt differently from the equitable distribution of property. With debt, we are looking at who is most able to pay the debt. Now, that's one part of the analysis. The other is who got the benefit of it. Look, if I have a debt for a lawnmower and I can't pay for it well, that's going to ultimately be something that the court can't really take care of. And you're probably going to have to give back the lawnmower. But what we want to do is make sure, to the best of the court's ability, remember, this is a stranger sitting on a bench in a robe. They don't know these people. They don't know their spending habits. They don't know how they've lived their lives before they filed this petition for dissolution or their complaint for divorce. They have no idea how they got into whatever situation they're in. But the court will do the best they can to make sure that the debts get paid by the individual who has the ability to pay it. Now, this is where you hear a lot of screaming and yelling about divorces. How come I have to pay for the car, but she's driving it? Well, because she doesn't have an income, and it benefits you that she's able to drive your children around, and you make 100% of the income, and therefore you're going to pay 100% of the marital debt. That's how that's going to work. And people really hate it. Now, if parties make virtually the same amount of income, maybe they met at work and they make the same pay from the same employer, okay, well then the debts are going to equitably be shared 50-50. But that usually doesn't happen. Usually there is one spouse who makes more than the other, especially if there are children, because again, remember, somebody's got to take care of the kids. So whoever has the responsibility, the primary responsibility of making sure the kids get to school on time and have lunches and get to their dance lessons and football practice, well, guess what? That person probably can't work as much and probably isn't going to make as much money as the one who is able to do their job without having to worry about what's going on with the children, at least primarily. So distribution of debt is tricky, and it is fraught with a lot of emotions because people have a lot of emotions that are tied to money. But that is our starting point. Who benefited from it and who is able to pay it? Now, told you we get to student loans. If you took out a student loan, it's your student loan. Period. I don't care if you're able to pay it or not able to pay it. The court is not going to distribute it. Why? You got the primary benefit of the education. Did the other party get the benefit of it because you were able to make more money and support the household? Yeah, sure. Doesn't matter. You are the primary beneficiary of that education. You are going to be responsible for paying it. That's a big deal. Receipts become a really big part of this discussion. And if you're not a receipt keeper, start being one. Okay, it's a really good habit to get into, especially if you are in a situation where you think things might be going a little funny. You want to make sure that you have receipts. Now, in the world of digital everything, it's a little easier to get credit card statements and bank statements and figuring out what was paid for what. But that is how you prove it. That's how you prove that the credit card bill that was in both of your names was really used so that he could take his mistress on a vacation. And you didn't get any benefit from that, so you're not going to pay for that. So you split up what you can split up according to benefit, and then you apportion it according to the ability to pay. That is our bottom line. Now, what if we have a situation where we have one spouse who has a gambling problem or a drug addiction problem and has taken all the money out of the savings account and all the money out of the 401k, has basically bled the family dry? They're going to end up being responsible for paying that back. That is going to end up being a marital debt that the party who has squandered, or in the law we call it wasted money, they're going to be responsible for paying it back. Now, they're not going to have to pay back 100% of it because they are are able to spend half of it, half of that money that they wasted, that frittered up into whatever was theirs, but the other half wasn't. That was a marital asset. And so we're going to create a debt for that individual to pay back that money. Now, if someone has a gambling problem or a drug addiction problem, what's the likelihood they're going to pay that money back? They're not. The law says one thing, and we can create an obligation, but they may not pay back that obligation. The likelihood is actually they won't pay back that obligation. So what do? This is where we horse trade. This is where we say, you took $100,000 out of our savings account and you went to the racetrack and you blew it. You owe me $50,000. The house is worth $100,000. So you own 50% and I own 50%. So you own $50,000 worth of the value of the house. You're going to give me the house, and I'm not going to owe you $50,000. That's how that works. We horse trade with debts and assets. This is what I mean when I say we have a ledger sheet. We say, this is what I own, equitably distributed. This is what I owe. Let's trade. And especially in those cases where we have someone who has wasted marital assets. And again, usually because of some kind of an addiction or because they have an extramarital affair and they're taking money and they're spending it on the third party. Then we are going to horse trade those, because the likelihood of you getting that is pretty much nil. You're never going to see that money that was wasted at the racetrack. So what does he have to horse trade, or what does she have to horse trade? That's what you do. Okay? That is a lot of the negotiation that happens in order for a divorce to go from a contested divorce where the complaint's filed and we're having our pretrial hearing and we're getting ready for trial, and the uncontested divorce where we say, okay, we've agreed, we've split everything up, we've agreed. This is where we're at. Okay? Most divorces end up that way. Now, let's throw another little area of law into this discussion of debt. Bankruptcy law. You'd be hard-pressed to find a family law or domestic relations lawyer out there who also doesn't do bankruptcy law or doesn't share an office with someone who does bankruptcy law. Most people who are married today exist on a double income. It's hard with most lifestyles today to not have a double income. A his and her income. What happens when you take a household that is fully supported by two incomes and split it apart? We now have two incomes, two households operating on half of the income that they're used to. And unless these people together were good savers and were disciplined and didn't amass a ton of debt, these two incomes that get split apart and have to live on half of the money that they're used to can't make it. And so what happens? Bankruptcy. Happens in a large number of divorces that are filed. So when a lawyer sees a client in the office, they're going to look at the assets that they're their marital assets, and then they're going to look at the debts. And if it looks like the debts are, there's no way on half of an income or half of a household income that these debts can be paid, they're going to recommend that the parties file for bankruptcy before they even file for divorce. And why is that? Well, under bankruptcy law, and again, this goes to the fact that you can't just do you can't just do domestic relations law. You have to know property law, you have to know bankruptcy law. Okay? So bankruptcy courts are in federal court. That's different from divorce court, which is a state court. And under federal bankruptcy law, you are entitled to file jointly, husband and wife, for bankruptcy. So if you're divorced, it's going to be 2 separate bankruptcies, which is going to be 2 separate filing fees and 2 separate attorney's fees. File it together, save on your costs, get rid of all the debt you can possibly get rid of, then file for divorce and streamline it, because you don't even have to worry about debt. Okay? Now, in bankruptcy law, under bankruptcy law, there are some debts you can't get rid of, and taxes and child support and spousal support that you owe, and student loans. Excuse me. Student loans. You can't get rid of them. Okay, but you can get rid of credit cards. You can figure out some way to get rid of the mortgage and understand who's going to buy out whom, or sell the house. You can get rid of a lot of debt in bankruptcy. And so that makes it easier to apportion the remaining debt in the divorce. Now, if I file for divorce and then file for bankruptcy, everything goes on hold on my divorce until my bankruptcy case is over. And that's because, excuse me, there's something called an automatic stay that goes into effect in every bankruptcy proceeding. Once I file for bankruptcy, creditors can't continue to get interest, creditors can't call me, all lawsuits stop. Okay, well, a divorce is a lawsuit. So it stops until the bankruptcy case is over. Now, bankruptcy courts will give domestic relation courts and other cases that might be going forward something called a relief from automatic stay. It means, okay, we've looked at this, and we as the federal court think that it's really not going to impact the bankruptcy all that much. Go ahead and get your divorce. Sometimes that happens, sometimes it doesn't, and why do you want to roll the dice? Really kind of depends on how many assets you have and how many debts you have, whether the court is going to say, okay, we'll go ahead and give you relief from stay so you can get your divorce done. But you have to know that the divorce stops until either the bankruptcy is over or until the bankruptcy court grants relief from automatic stay. Either way, you've got to pause. For people who want their case to go forward, why do you want to do that? So filing for bankruptcy before you file for divorce is a reasonable thing for a divorce attorney to advise clients to do. Now, you can't do it in every case, right? Sometimes people don't know they're getting a divorce, they're still living together. There are issues that pop up. But if you can, that's a really good way to ultimately streamline the divorce going forward. Sometimes what will happen in a preliminary hearing, or not preliminary, I'm sorry, in your first pretrial hearing, where the magistrate judge is saying, okay, until the divorce is ordered, we're going to put these temporary orders in place. And so you pay this bill, you pay this bill, you pay this. Sometimes one party gets kind of vengeful and spiteful and says, that's fine, I'll pay all the bills, and then doesn't pay them. They don't pay them. So if they're supposed to be paying the car payment, they don't pay it. Repo man comes. Or if they're supposed to pay the mortgage and they don't pay the mortgage, you can go into foreclosure. Sometimes people are just mean and vengeful. Sometimes they really can't pay it. But most of the time they don't pay it because they're like, forget you. I'm not doing this. Is that okay? Is it okay? Can the court make them pay it? Well, they can, but the problem is when you have joint debts. So let's say it's a mortgage and husband and wife have taken out a joint mortgage on a joint and survivorship ownership of their house. And let's say at the first pretrial hearing, the husband is supposed to pay the mortgage. And he says, forget you, I'm not paying that mortgage. She's staying in the house. I'm not paying it. And the house goes into foreclosure. Can they go into foreclosure? Can the wife say to the bank, hey, wait a second, he's supposed to be paying it? The bank says, we don't really care what's going on in domestic relations court. Your name is on this contract. You're just as liable for the debt as he is. So if he doesn't pay it, we're coming after you. And that happens. A lot. A lot. Maybe not so much with houses, because whoever it is wants to keep the value of the house, maybe to sell it or whatever. But with credit cards, definitely. Joint credit cards, if the wife is supposed to pay the credit card and she doesn't, and then the credit card company starts calling the husband, and the husband's like, wait a second, she's supposed to be paying it. And they're like, Matt, we don't really care. Your name is on the card. Sorry. You're responsible for this. What recourse do you have? Not much. That's the short answer. What you can do is you can go back to domestic relations court and you can say, look, they're not paying this bill. And the court will say, pay that bill. And the bill still doesn't get paid. So sometimes just because you have people who are not playing by the rules, you have to file for bankruptcy in the middle of a divorce. Sometimes that just happens. And that is to preserve every bit of assets that you have. Let's say it's a mortgage that's not getting paid. Put a hold on it. You want that automatic stay so that a foreclosure doesn't go forward, so that you can sort everything out. A bankruptcy will give you some breathing space to get that accomplished. It's unfortunate, and it happens all the time. Another thing that happens all the time, and really this is the one that makes me the saddest, is there'll be a separation agreement, or a court will have an order, and at the very end it will be ordered and or agreed to that one party pay certain debts. And then the divorce is final, and that party says, I'm not paying those debts. Same thing happens if it's a joint debt. The creditor starts calling the party that wasn't supposed to pay those debts, who then say, wait a second, he or she was supposed to pay the debt, not me. And the creditor again says, don't care. Don't care. Your name's still on the contract. You're on the hook. And then you have to file for bankruptcy. Because the spouse that was ordered to pay everything chose not to. And that really stinks. Because the whole thing could have been completely avoided if you just filed for bankruptcy at the very beginning. But now your credit is completely ruined. Now it's going to get, you're not going to have great credit after a bankruptcy anyway. But you were operating under a set of assumptions that this was over, that we had resolved it. And then you just tear open the wound again. And you have to file for bankruptcy. Happens. A lot. A lot. So, I'll go back to what I started with. If you practice domestic relations law, the likelihood is you are going to know somebody who does bankruptcy law and refer every case to them, or you're also going to do bankruptcy law, because the two go hand in hand. Financial issues are central to most divorces. And unfortunately, a good number of those financial issues get resolved before, during, or after a divorce with bankruptcy. It just is. And for those cases where you don't have bankruptcy, what you do is you make sure that you have assets to balance out debts so that we can do our horse trading, so that everybody pretty much ends up with what they want at the end of the day. Okay? All right. There is the case of In Re, the marriage of Angeline Holthus and Nicholas Holthus in your chapter. It's actually a long case. I'm going to have you read that. It's about dissipation. It's about somebody who basically squanders or wasted all of the assets of a marriage, and how the court dealt with it. Unfortunately, in the world we're in right now, where we have a lot of drug abuse, this is very common. More cases than I have ever seen are involving cases of dissipation where marital assets are just squandered. So that's why I'm going to have you read this case so that you can get a feeling of how courts deal with this issue. Okay? I'm also going to give you in your questions a fact pattern that has to do with balancing out who gets what between assets and debts, and for you to come up with an answer. This is so that I can understand that you understand how this whole process works, that we have a balance sheet and we figure out what part everybody has to pay and what part everybody gets to keep. Okay, so look for that, and if you have any questions, please feel free to email me. Thanks.